We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm joined once again by my two colleagues, assistant editor at The Federalist, Kylie Zempel, and senior editor at The Federalist, Christopher Bedford, putting the senior in his title, as always, and will surely pull rank over the course of this conversation.
I learned pretty quickly in previous media jobs when a senior editor didn't know how to post articles on the back end. That senior editor is the least meaningful title in DC. And there are a lot of meaningless titles in DC, but it actually doesn't really imply anything.
This is actually good from my perspective because a lot of people think my title is really the least meaningful title in DC. Culture editor.
Assistant editor tells you nothing.
Well, you're Chris's assistant.
When I was first working for the Daily Caller, and we'll get to the subject in a moment because there's some important stuff to talk about. But when I was first working for the Daily Caller, we were called online editors. And I pointed out, hey, we don't have a print publication. So I think, aren't we all online editors? Like, oh yeah, it's kind of crazy. They changed it to associate editor. And then everyone thought I'd been demoted.
Probably should have been. All right. As Chris mentioned, there is some serious stuff to talk about. We wanted to weigh in on yet another viral video of member of the community interacting with police officers and again, ending tragically. And that would be the one of Micaiah Bryant, who was shot by a police officer. It literally in the process of stabbing another minor.
I mean, ends tragically is a stretch. What would have been tragic as an unarmed girl being stabbed to death?
No, but I think absolutely. But I think it's actually tragic on behalf of the officer as well, that the officer is now really thrust into the middle of the situation for doing his job. The White House even condemning and implying that it was racist, smearing him as racist. And on top of that, a 16-year-old girl is dead. And I think that's tragic because, it's somewhere along the line, the fact that you have a 16-year-old girl who's impelled to knife another person, something went wrong. And that's tragic.
It was tragic before the police officer ever got there, before he ever fired. I mean, the whole situation was tragic when you have teenagers going at each other with knives. Not at each other. Only one of the girls had a knife as far as we know. But it definitely was tragic. Yeah.
No, I think that's well said. But what we want to talk about here is how, yet again, we're mired in a controversy over a viral video. The video went viral, though, after reports emerged about what had happened. This was, I think shortly, it was around the time that the Chauvin verdict was rendered. And so as that emerged on social media, there was already outrage among the similar sorts of pundits and social justice activists who immediately framed this as a George Floyd-esque situation. I mean, at this point, it seems like we have a video like this once a month, and often we find that they are lacking context. Jacob Blake from our home state of Wisconsin, that is another great example of something where when the story goes viral, sometimes it does seem immediately outrageous, and then context emerges, and we know a lot more. But we live in this climate where we have these conversations instantaneously. And it seems as though, I don't know, I would actually be curious for Chris's take on this because you've been around the media longer than us. Is there any way for us to get out of this cycle of instant reactions that lack context? Will we ever have a more cautious media again?
I think it would have to be. I mean, I think that if this is an example of a case where we don't, then it's going to be hard. We're hard pressed to see it ever happen, because here's a case that people are misrepresenting from start to finish. They're saying it's a knife fight. I keep on hearing that over and over again. I've seen knife fights. I've seen a lot of fights. This was not a knife fight. This was a stabbing.
It was a knife attack.
It was not. It was the other person didn't have a knife. And you know what? Maybe at some point earlier in the day that they did. And that's not there. And it wasn't there when the police were there. But that young lady who was almost killed, and knives to kill very easily, was standing against the car when the officer came up yelling, "Stop, stop, stop." And the young lady who was shot attacked her with a knife, lunged at her. The girl who the would-be victim was her back against the car, her feet up and her hands up trying to defend herself. And this wasn't holding a knife while attacking somebody. She had her hand out to all the way, fully extended for a thrust, and those are rapid, and those cause massive damage inside, and it's not a small knife. And
aiming at the chest area.
For most people, don't call the police to prevent crimes. Well, they do, but they shouldn't because it doesn't happen. The police often respond to crime. They rope things off. If someone's breaking into your home, it's best to defend your home because the police are going to come there and collect evidence after and say that they have no leads. But this officer, I think most officers would have frozen. It was a very quick moving, crazy situation, and only the camera showed what a heroic and quick thinking and well aiming officer they are.
The body camera.
Yeah, the body camera, because handguns are actually not that easy to aim and shoot, like the movies. And this woman is moving, and he, after screaming, stop, 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 sees the arm out with the knife, pulls the gun, and opens fire and saves the girl's life.
Right.
From horrible disfigurement or very possibly fatal death. Saved a young black girl who was the second person who'd been attacked since the police officer had been there. And to paint this as a knife fight, as a children's fight, as anything other than murder, and to be so incredibly stupid to not realize that children in this country have been killing each other for a long time. In Washington, D.C., an old Uber driver absolutely murdered, gruesomely murdered, while trying to fight for his car by two young girls. I got news to you. My city is overrun with children carrying guns, running around, committing crime. You witnessed one just yesterday. It's rampant in this city, and to say that there's a child, screw that.
This is all in the context of that, carjacking. I mean, when the reports first came out and people were commenting on Twitter that she was just a child, she was just a child. It's like,
and she is, you're right. You guys are right. That is sad,
and that's part of the tragedy.
And you're right.
You have children committing these crimes,
but that was attempted murder,
right?
Oh yeah,
exactly. Which is why the fact that she is a child is irrelevant.
Well, I think it's relevant to the extent that it's a tragedy.
The police officer didn't check IDs.
Right.
Now, when I was 16, I thought of myself as an adult. Also, by the way, I was a very bad 16-year-old. I am fortunate that I was never shot by police. I had guns pulled on me by police.
You're fortunate you've never been shot by me.
I'm still trying. I'm not going to settle for no goals yet. I mean,
hang in there, bud.
I think it'll happen any day now. I think it will happen. I'm playing the long game. We got roughed up sometimes. We deserved it. The police. I mean, we had some police who were great, and some police who just kind of wanted to knock you. And I was a punk kid, but things also. I knew other kids who were bad, and things got out of hand really quickly. But now you've seen this firsthand since moving back. Crime is happening everywhere. 9mm shells shot in my backyard, right near my backyard, in a nice neighborhood with families and dogs fairly recently. Do I think that was a 25-year-old shooting that gun? Probably not. It was probably a 16 or 17-year-old kid. If I'd been out there and they'd been shooting that gun, would I have opened fire on them? I would have said no. I said, go home to your mother.
Yeah.
Or get out of here. But it can get very deadly very quickly.
Well, Kylie, let me ask. I think part of the problem, and I was getting at this to my question originally to Chris, which is that some of this does seem to be a unique element of social media's influence on the media more broadly. Without Twitter, I don't know that these sort of local incidents would be blown up into painful and divisive and poorly informed national news cycles. What do you think about that?
I think the media loves to capitalize on these. They are these local incidents and turn them into big national stories because they can capitalize on them. They can sit in their, safe high rises. They can sit in their, gated communities and tweet and, speculate wildly about these local stories that they have no personal investment in. I actually learned about the story before I saw any news headlines about it. I learned about it on Instagram because someone that I am friends with who is very active in the Black Lives Matter movement had posted a story about this girl who called police, who then arrived to shoot her, and she was unarmed and she was 15, and the whole thing. And my first reaction,
wrong.
Are you friends with LeBron James?
Semi-speed dial. No, my first reaction was, I need to find out what actually happened because, and I don't think that any corporate media, or politicians have that instinct at all. They see these isolated instances. They get a few details that seem juicy and they instantly run with it. And it's how you create a narrative and gin up emotions and protests and enthusiasm for your movement before you know any of the facts. Mm-hmm. It truly, honestly, is effective at inciting violence, and that's really not hyperbole.
And no one in their own ranks have called this out. So LeBron James, who tweeted out a picture of the police officer's name has been withheld, so he doesn't get lynched for saving a young girl's life and thinking quickly and going home. The chances he's been sleeping this week, extremely low.
Oh yeah.
And
he didn't do anything to deserve that.
No, and he's gonna have to live with that for a long time. Mm-hmm. It's gonna be tough.
Well, I should say he didn't do anything to deserve that we know. I think by all the information we have, we can make a rational judgment. But again, I think part of the problem, and we should exercise this on our side too, or practice this on our side too, is that we can't rush to judgment before we have processes in place to investigate these exact situations where somebody is shot, where an officer fires his weapon in the line of duty. We have processes in place to investigate those things. And so I'm going to say, trust the process, right?
That's true. Right. It's the thing that people, the police, the way the police operate, what he knew about the situation, in all likelihood, is exactly what we know, which is he got a call, that there was an altercation, he got out of his car. He obviously didn't start off approaching, prone with his gun drawn, everyone against the wall. He was walking up and then saw a fight amongst what probably looked like teenagers or young adults and started screaming, stop, 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 and approaching quickly, and then quickly saw that fight turning into rapidly attempted murder. Mm-hmm. And he made a move. So I imagine that he probably knew just about as much as we did going in there. Maybe he'd been at that house before. Maybe he knew. Maybe he was familiar with that neighborhood.
But also, we're not judging this officer or the situation based on just body cam footage or even just due process or anything like that. You have to remember the media landscape. It's not that police officers, this is happening at the end of the Chauvin trial. So that's fresh on everyone's mind. But the media's track record is to get all of these things wrong. Not even just innocent until proven guilty, but look how wrong they got it with Jacob Blake. Look how wrong they got it with Michael Brown. They have a track record of completely spinning the story. Correct. They'll never admit it. But they have this track record of spinning the story. So this is not just against the landscape of Derek Chauvin. This is with all of the background information that we have from other police incidents where the media got it completely wrong. Officers actually saved lives, their own or someone else's. And we have that context, and a lot of the media is just not bringing that to bear on this situation.
And they won't acknowledge this what they first reported was just a young unarmed girl shot by the police. Actually, was an attempted murder stopped of another young girl.
Yeah,
and they have it on video, and they'll just sweep it under the rug.
NBC News did.
Yeah, NBC News, ESPN didn't cover it.
Called it a knife fight.
Knife fight. Yeah. These fools! It ain't a knife fight.
Yeah. Well, there you go, Chris. They didn't live the Irish version of The Departed like you did. It's basically his childhood. That's
like calling the Circus Maximus gladiators. No, they were feeding people to lions.
It was awesome to watch. In sort of comparison to the circus and the gladiator thing. But Kylie, I want to ask you, this is it did remind me of the sort of Jacob Blake situation where when the context about the original call came in, and that took about a day, maybe more, to come into the media and for us to kind of be aware of, that actually really, really did change the context of the entire situation. The domestic violence, all of that was changed dramatically by the context that came in later. And that context can go in either direction, right? That context can go in the direction of making the officer look better or worse, making the deceased look better or worse. Jacob Blake, of course, didn't actually die. But, that's so important. And I think it's bizarre to me that we have these situations because of, in my opinion, social media that elevates and plucks out these local situations, immediately thrusts them into the national spotlight which makes people, the pundit class, sort of feel compelled to weigh in on them. It's ridiculous. I mean, first of all,
And they're not censoring it.
Right.
The reporters, first of all, shouldn't be waxing an opinion to begin with, even though they don't actually realize that it's ideology and opinion anymore because the fish don't know they're wet. But at the same time, like, it's so anathema to the craft of journalism. But they are all sort of pushed by their fellow journalists and by this media climate where everything is instant and news cycles are so fast and social media demands. I mean, Andrew Yang has been criticized for not being literally the first person to respond when the Atlanta spa shootings broke into the news. So there's this enormous pressure for people to react instantly. And I don't know how we fix that.
So with the Jacob Blake thing, I mean, by the time, if I'm not wrong, if it was the next day, by the time we had access to the phone call, buildings were already burned. You know, riots were already well on their way.
And you were there.
Yes, I was there after and aftermath talking to business owners who lost their business. And I mean, they're just standing in front of a pile of ashes talking about it in completely past tense. And you know, it's interesting to talk about social media because it's easy to fault things that are benign like that. Like, social media itself does not organically elevate these stories. It's like these localized stories are put on social media by local people, but like big name journalists and people who have something to gain from exploiting these things are digging them up and elevating them. You know, it's not like they rise to the top of a Twitter algorithm organically because everyone, you know, it wasn't like, oh, everyone in Columbus is talking about this, so therefore it's a national story. It's like, oh, somebody in New York and DC gets wind of this story and amplifies it, and then it spreads to, you know, the levels of LeBron James and everything. It's like, this isn't some social media, you know, we're not really sure who's doing it. It's like, no, they have something to gain by exploiting these people's circumstances that they're not personally invested in, but they can get clicks from them. They can use it as a red herring to distract from actual news happening here, like, you know, the House trying to make DC the 51st state and whatever's happening in the White House. It is a big deal. It's a really big deal. And not that, you know, not that we shouldn't be talking about kids trying to stab other kids. Like, that's a very important cultural problem. This violence that's happening.
Yeah, but I mean,
but also, like,
the reality is that, like, most adults don't really stab other adults. It's like a teenage thing. Like, West Side Story is not about 31-year-olds.
We'll take your word for it.
Romeo and Juliet are not in their 30s. They're like 16. Like that's the people who think they're going to live forever, who have no control over their emotions, who maybe who are going through puberty, who are much more informed by violent music. I mean, like those are their heroes and stuff. Like, because before you've like grown up and sort of like look around you and like mature. Like 16, 17, that is prime time for stupid decisions. Which is why, like, you know, the Marines aren't really interested in recruiting someone who's 30. They want someone who's 18. Like, here's a gun. Go up that hill. There's a machine gun up there. Go up the hill. Just like you go. Like, that's the age.
Yeah.
And that's just it's a sad part about our society. That's part of the reasons why I say, like, you can't vote. Like, you don't have access to all the same privileges of an adult. Like, you're still going through some pretty crazy stuff.
But that's why parents need to protect their children from having the impulse to pick up a knife and stab their friend.
Yeah, I mean, a parent's like a good archer. Like, I mean, I don't know what the deal is. It seems like she had a pretty troubled home life. But even the best parents, like, a good archer. You shoot that arrow as hard and straight as you want, but if the wind catches it and starts to shake, I mean, it's gone.
And the wind is culture in that.
Yeah, there's only so much a parent can do, unless you want to be a helicopter parent, and then you break the wind away. I mean, Tom Hanks can't raise a good kid. I mean, Chet Hanks with an X. It's a white boy summer.
Okay, anyway, off topic. But I guess my question then is there's a lot downstream. There are a lot of sort of cultural effects that happen downstream of the media's rush to judgment. It has very serious implications for shaping our norms and shaping our reality. It shapes our opinion of this country. And one thing I think is under-discussed in the context of all this conversation about Joe Biden comparing the Georgia voting reform bill to Jim Eagle, having basically the entire left.
It's a really cool make-believe name.
Jim Eagle, yeah, it's my superhero alter ego. But alter eagle. Anyway, yeah, it was good. It wasn't. Well, you shouldn't have poured this Woodford. Anyway, So the point is, there are a lot of things that happen downstream of the media's rush to judgment, and I want to sort of just focus in on LeBron James, who is not a journalist, and I don't have any high expectations for LeBron James, who deleted his tweet. He put up a picture of the officer, allegedly of the officer involved in the shooting, and said something about like you're next accountability.
You're next.
Right.
And accountability.
Right. And I think LeBron James, who has sort of fashioned himself as, or styled himself as an activist post George Floyd's death, he was trying to say it's like a Chauvin thing. You're next after Derek Chauvin, but he like put up a full picture of this guy's face, and then we had our writer Gabe Kaminsky reach out to like the Staples Center to say, will you, exert the same corporate pressure basically that everyone did in Georgia after LeBron James does something as despicable and dangerous as this? And they, of course, said no, right? Like they said, we're upholding our values, et cetera, et cetera.
We value all people. Do you value cops? We have nothing to say.
Right. And that's the thing.
Do you value other black children who are about to get
all lives matter?
But that's exactly right. And so I think one thing that people don't discuss enough is how all of these narratives, if you are an average person whose job is not to work in media and doesn't pay attention to everything, you rely on the media to tell you what's going on. And if the president of the United States and all of the legacy media is supporting this narrative that Georgia just passed something tantamount to Jim Crow, I do not blame people for buying that narrative when they have to deal with their kids' educations, their own jobs, their parents, etc. People have a lot of stuff to do, and they can't be on Twitter all day like the Zoom journalist class. And so, it creates this perception of the country as a much more racist and dangerous place than it is. You have like the Staples, which puts legitimate fear into people. And that's unfair. Mm-hmm. That's unjust. And then you have the Staples Center and other corporations. LeBron James has a deal with Nike. Are they going to exert the same pressure that all these corporations like Coca-Cola jumped to do in Georgia? Absolutely not. And this shapes our norms, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I just had a thought and I totally lost it. It was going to be really good. I can promise you.
Well, let's kick it to Chris because he always has thoughts.
It's extremely dangerous, and we have a completely perverted idea of what's going on. And it reminds me of what we've been hearing from all the activist judges, or activist lawyers, and the activists around the Chauvin case, which is that what is actual justice? What is going on here with justice? And they're saying this is not justice. I'm saying, what do you mean? The person who did wrong to George Floyd is now probably going to prison, maybe 40 years.
Yeah.
Guilty on all three counts. Mm-hmm. What if that's not justice? Then what is? They're like, well, justice is if America was convicted. Justice is if George Floyd is back from the dead. I'm like, well, that's actually not justice. Mm-hmm. This is justice. This is Abrahamic justice. This is justice as it's been understood. Because we are not God. We cannot raise Lazarus. Mm-hmm. All we can do is what God has given us, like the justice that we've been given on earth since Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. Like action, consequence, rights violated, property violated, person violated, consequences, anything that can be done, but you can't bring them back. You can't restore that. And that's actual justice, what we saw with George Floyd. And they're saying it wasn't. Meanwhile, for the last year, we've had, just like you were talking about, store owners standing in front of ashes that were their lives. Mm-hmm. Old men who went down to protect their front stores, retired police officers, never returning to their wives, gunned down in the streets, police officers run over with cars because they stood in line to try and protect cities, federal agents blinded temporarily, the store owners beaten, people murdered, looting with no repercussions, while these fruitcakes chant no justice, no peace, and they claim, well, that's justice. Mm-hmm. That's justice for George Floyd. But actual criminal justice, you're a jury of your peers holding you accountable. The system holding you accountable is not justice, and that's systemic racism. The system just held you accountable. Everything you're saying is a lie.
Right.
Everything. And the whole point of you is to say that America is not just. You're saying that injustice is justice. You're saying that justice is injustice. You're saying a system that just put a police officer, who, by the way, you have no idea if he's racist, in prison, or sending him to, he's in prison now.
That's a good point, by the way.
Is systemic racism. They just put him in prison. 100%.
Right.
What are you talking about, the system?
And no evidence of like literal racism,
Right.
as we
No.
understand the definition,
Right.
was ever raised in that trial. And you can say that it highlights, you can make the argument that this highlights problems with the police and the Black community. You can make that argument. To make the argument that Derek Chauvin is sort of incontrovertibly a racist is totally different. And we don't have evidence of that.
I think it also goes back to another
But the
cultural...
country burned for months.
Right.
But,
For an entire summer.
Yeah.
For justice.
But I think a lot of this goes back to another cultural problem we have, which is somewhat related to identity politics. And that is to hold, not to hold people responsible for the things that they do, but to hold other people who didn't actually do them responsible. So, in the same way that all Trump supporters are white supremacists, is that all police officers are responsible for what happened to George Floyd.
Even Black police officers, by the way. I remember this summer
They're white
watching a
adjacent.
white woman
Mhm.
in Lululemon pants, and
Yep.
we have this video up on the site. A white woman in Lululemon pants screaming in the face of a Black female police officer, which shows all of their purported interest in intersectionality is complete nonsense. But there are a lot of Black police officers that would be implicated in this racist system, and the left is fine with that.
Right.
It's
Because
incoherent, but
it's assigning responsibility and moral blame to people who have absolutely no connection to things. And there's nothing just about that.
well, this is interesting because there was this emergent narrative after the Chauvin verdict was rendered that said that was accountability. It was not justice. What about that distinction, Kylie? That I saw it on like celebrity social media accounts that it's accountability, but it's not justice. And to me, it fits into this entire notion that the left is completely seeing the glass as half empty when it is half full in this country. And you can see, I mean, I don't mean to like tie this to something wildly off topic, but I do want to say when you have the representative to the UN in the Biden administration going off, and I think Jake Sullivan as well, another Biden administration official talking on the world stage about how America needs to check its own issues, needs to talk about its own history of systemic racism and white supremacy, et cetera, when we are, relative to the scope of human history, one of the greatest societies to ever have this we are literally the greatest society to ever bring so many different people from different backgrounds together, have the American experiment, which involves so much blood, sweat, and tears to create a legal system that is not racist, that has equality under the law. And to say that America needs to apologize when just about every other country...
300,000 men gave their lives to free the slaves.
Yes.
We don't need to have a freaking conversation about it. We need to talk about it in history classes. Right. And history, by the way, should still be taught.
Right.
And we've been successful. That's the thing. We do have our laws. We have equality under the law. And is anything perfect? Absolutely not.
Right.
Of course, it's not perfect. But to again say that it's accountability, it's not justice, when our system created justice. Our system created that verdict, which is justice. And they can't even bring themselves to acknowledge that the process worked and did produce justice.
The fact is that if that's not justice, then nothing is. Yeah. I mean, justice is impossible.
It's meaningless.
Yes. And it goes back to what Chris said. You can't raise a dead person. You cannot bring George Floyd back. People are imperfect. We do the best that we can to punish wrongdoers and to hold them accountable for the things that they do. But beyond that is as high of justice as we can attain on this earth.
Exactly.
And we can't do any better than that. And burning down, a local store is not justice. None of the remedies, none of the remedies are actually justice. This is the best we can do. And that's one thing too, and not to get totally off topic, but that's one thing that we've lost as people have abandoned faith is the hope that we have in a judgment day, in final justice where everyone will be ultimately held accountable, even if verdicts don't go the way that we want them to, or even if people have reasonable doubt, or even if due process fails someone. It's like that's as good of justice as human beings can accomplish, and accountability, that's justice in this case.
And I don't think that they have God in their minds, or heaven on their minds when they're talking about what they want for justice. I think they're talking about just like the same thing that they're talking about when they want to redefine history, when they want to redefine the system, when they want to redefine. So give me some examples of just some of the words that they've been trying
bigotry,
to redefine.
white supremacy, racism, violence.
Violence, words of violence.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about just power, raw
Right.
power, and they want it.
Well, I want to actually, Chris, the question that I wanted to toss to you was, is this not the rotten fruit of postmodernism? When you're saying that they don't have God in mind, and you have Kylie talking very, I think, accurately and eloquently about how at the end of the day, their version of justice is essentially meaningless or impossible. It's one of the two. And I think that probably that is, probably rooted in this idea or this reality that they don't believe in reality. I mean, if you look at college newspapers, there are op-eds about how white supremacy or about how free speech is a white supremacist construct. Okay.
Being on time is a white supremacist construct too.
I mean, you can apply it to, you can
like
say,
they said, I've seen that in posters.
yeah, no, they say that.
That'd be, in order for me to have made that up and just crack that as an original joke in the Federalist, I'd be like extremely racist.
Well, yeah, but they actually say
it
it.
has to come from a racist mind.
But that's why this all. This is why
mine's just pure. It's like white snow in here.
Postmodernism boomerangs back to actual racism with segregated dorms. That's an actual thing that happens on college campuses now. Segregated dormitories, segregated this and that. And it's because it is not, and I'll kick this to you because I'm curious for your opinion. Is it not because at the end of the day, they don't actually have a foundation. They might think they do, but their foundation is incoherent to the point where it's built on a house of sand.
Yeah, it's built on a house of sand. And I think that Ben Domenech put it really well on his Monday show. And by the way, he's got 2 more nights to be hosting, so you should tune in 7:00 on Fox News for Ben's show. He said they want a divorce. There's a serious segment in this country who want to split it. I mean, and you're seeing this over and over again. And I mean, I don't want to be like one of the lazy leftists who only can think of Hitler and the Confederacy when they think of anything historical. So you fall into one of those two camps if you disagree with them. But they're saying that like federal troops protecting a courthouse is an occupation of Portland. Sounds like extremely Fort Sumter logic to me. Segregate all of the people. The races are different. I'm like, that's super Confederate sounding to me.
Where have I heard that before?
We need to split this country in half. Like we want a divorce. The founding is not working out for us. I mean, at least, what's different from them and the Confederates is the Confederates claim they were the real founders. They had the real lineage to George Washington. We were the Unionists on the other side. But I'm seeing a lot of just super Confederate echoes in this line of thinking. And it's not split up by state. It's split up. They're trying to split people. They're trying to do what the Marxists did. I think Ben talked about this as well. When they tried to bring it out on class, and class didn't work in the United States because we don't really have set classes, despite what the left wants you to say. Families rise and fall all the time in this country.
Unless you're a Biden.
Yeah, I don't know how many generations. I don't know how many generations of power they have left. But they go up and down. So the class didn't work, and now they're like, "Oh, race. We'll make it about race." And they've erased and tried to reverse, or they've tried to reverse decades and decades and decades of progress this country has made. Like what you ladies were saying, the greatest multiracial republic and the most peaceful multiracial republic in history. They're trying to erase it. I don't know if it's working. Like, I don't notice any difference in my interactions. I don't notice increased hostility. I notice increased crime, but I think that's not a thing about the racial stuff. I think that's a thing about policing and kids not being in school. But in general here in DC, like, it hasn't really... It's only strained my relationships with some white people I know because they're so awful.
Right.
But I mean, it's like...
You can just say it was me.
You've become insufferable at dinner parties
and cocktail parties. I was the person in Lululemon yelling at the cop.
Yeah.
But no, it's funny because when you mentioned the sort of like neo-Confederacy, it's the left is not in their minds. They are not Confederates. They don't espouse the Confederate ideology. Their own weird ideology, which is not tethered to any principle. That it's very superficial. It's anti-racist, but not on any solid grounds. It's not tethered to anything like faith or a meaningful, I guess, interpretation of humanity, and et cetera, et cetera.
Hillary Clinton was their god, and Fauci's kind of a poor replacement.
Anyway, so they're not actual Confederates, but their ideology, which I hesitate to call an ideology because it's not actually really structured or based on principles, it ends up in the same racist place. It really does. And, Kylie, let me toss this to you. You spent most of the pandemic not in Washington, D.C. And
God bless you.
I know.
Land of beef sticks.
And cheese.
curds.
God bless it.
But anyway, so Kylie, is Chris onto something that the rest of the country is enduring this? The American spirit, the media is trying to break us down and break us down and break us down. The left is trying to break us down and break us down and break us down. But does the glass remain half full?
The media is doing its best to convince the half of the country that does not experience this ever that reality is different than it is. I mean, the only place that these racial conflicts really exist where I'm from is at the university level because professors are saying that it exists. Like, I don't
Perception becomes reality.
Yep.
The racial strife in Green Bay.
Right? There just isn't. I mean, you were just
Madison,
there.
that's adorable.
There just isn't. And it's funny to me when you talk to someone, I'll talk to my family or I'll talk to just some random people in my hometown. And I mean, it's like nothing there has really changed except that they get madder at the media because the things that they're saying just get more and more detached from reality.
And divisive.
But so much. But then, you talk to somebody who's a student at, UW-Madison or whatever, and they start to regurgitate things that they're learning in their classes, or they talk about how oppressed they are. And you're just like, you're going to a very expensive school. And
I'm being repressed.
You're a white person on the lacrosse team. You're fine.
Life is hard.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
We
these
need a
things.
war, like a real one.
A what? A war?
Like a real war.
Oh.
Like
Well, this is why nobody should ever
this
elect
plague
you.
just didn't do it. This was like a fake plague. Like, I really do think that virtue is increased with a little bit more hardship than we have. Because we
Well, you've read Screwtape Letters, yes.
yeah, I not in too long, and it's on my list to reread
You
because
should reread it.
I'm not able to reference it like I would like.
You should reread it in the context of the pandemic, because there's something just the pandemic and the sort of racial strife and the cultural strife that's ensued. The Screwtape Letters, which is a wartime piece of writing, talks about how, and if you're not familiar with the text, it's basically C.S. Lewis having this back and forth between, one of the devil's minions and his boss in hell. And it's in their exchange of letters, which gets kind of meta sometimes, but he's trying to
Starts kind of meta.
He's trying to suck this young English man, away from his relationship with Christ and towards, a life of sin, and secularism, essentially. And this man is a soldier. And it's incredible how, I won't spoil it because the sort of soldier part is essential to the end, but it is incredible how the concept of hardship can draw people away from secularism.
Yeah, the classic thing that there's no atheists in a sinking ship or no atheists in a foxhole. One of my parents' priests at Providence College converted or became a priest because he was on the decoy ship with the atomic bomb that didn't have the atomic bomb that no one knew about and that sank, and most of the survivors were eaten by sharks. He spent the whole night in the water hearing people dying around them. And he prayed. He's like, Lord, I'll become a priest. I'll become a priest if I don't get eaten by a shark. And he survived. And he kept that promise, which, not everyone does. Some people are like, oh, yeah, please, God, save me. Please, God, save me. Well, God answered your prayer. It's like, no, those 2 Indians came along and saved me along the trail. It's like, should be American Indians. But
indigenous people.
Indigenous people? Okay. I got to keep up.
You do.
Back to you. I guess I shall have to reread my Voltaire.
Well, you shall. So I'll just throw this question to both of you as you wrap up here. And Kylie, this is sort of a reiteration of what I just asked, but is for the rest of the country. Is the American spirit enduring despite the left and the media's, which is redundant, attempts to beat it down and down and down? I remember, I also grew up in Wisconsin in a very white area, but
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Wisconsin. A very white area, but really like the way that I was born in 1993, so grew up in the 90s and the early 2000s, and I mean this honestly, and some people would probably describe this as white privilege, never really thought about race. I mean, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about race. I think there are important things to think about when it comes to, racial inequality. Sometimes there are like legitimate issues to be had, but I never really thought about it. And I didn't think about it until well into the Obama years when I was in college. And particularly I'm thinking about like after the Trayvon Martin shooting, it suddenly became as though we had to think about it all of the time. And I know that's probably different, from for the couple of African-American people who grew up in my same very white community. They were probably thinking about race all the time. But as a white person, I didn't think any differently. And that's how I was taught. And that's what I taught I think is so beautiful. And I think people in our generation came from that mindset. And then I think the left has just pushed us to rewind the clock. And I'm wondering, if you think that is the way that a lot of the country still is, or if we are mired in these divisions and that the glass is, half full.
I think
half empty. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the country would love to talk about anything but race, not because they're deep-seated racists, but because they have concerns that are a lot more pressing than manufactured racism and being held responsible for other people's isolated instances of racism all of the time. It's exhausting. People have real concerns, and I think they're enduring, but they're running out of options because they lack, I think, the type of voices in the media and in government that are representing their actual concerns, because everybody's trying to outperform each other on the race issue. And a lot of Americans that's not their experience. They don't have all of these encounters with police. They're not experiencing, bullying and harassment or, microaggressions or whatever it is on a daily basis, or really ever. Like it's something that I think a lot of people don't think of. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, we should be talking about race when it becomes a conflict and when we have something to learn from each other, but not necessarily for no reason. And
remember the Starbucks movement to talk to people about race?
Yeah, that was
when they got their frickin' coffee.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminded me of, I wanted to see like Boston character Ben Affleck go in there and be like, the large black coffee, and be like, would you like a skim milk? Like, I want a freaking black coffee. It's like, would you like a grande? I want a freaking large. Like, have you heard about structural racism? And that's the part where he just like puts his hand into the glass or just whips his coffee behind the counter. It's like, this place is weird. Bar Duncan.
The notion of Ben Affleck walking into a Starbucks is ridiculous. Right.
Yeah, well, especially Boston Ben Affleck, Boston character.
He's Duncan.
It's very difficult for me to do a Boston accent without cursing, so it's difficult in the podcast.
Well, Chris, let me phrase this question a little bit differently as I toss it to you to wrap up. Is perception becoming reality?
Perception's always been reality. I mean, for as far as so many people are concerned, we've fought stupid wars over this, but. Yeah, I mean, I think that our big problem is, and it's completely, and people have written about it. There's some good books on it, but people just kind of push it aside. Like, what's that mean? Decadence, which is why I was talking about with, maybe the need for some real struggle in lives to come up. National struggle that brings us unification, not this BS struggle where we're all in this together by turning in our neighbors over COVID violations. But I'm reading about the 300 Years' War, which sadly, is probably what, if the left got their druthers and this country started to come apart, would look a lot more like the 30 Years' War than it would like the Civil War. States aren't going to line up. This is community stuff. This is people on people. This is a college town versus Wisconsin. It'd be very dangerous. But it's so interesting in the ambassadors and the Lord's letters back and forth. Decadence is an adjective that they use as if it is a strategic asset. Like, this is a state that 75 years ago was an extremely formidable foe, a very impressive ally. They have since succumbed to decadence, and they say it like it's fact. Like this kingdom succumbed to decadence. This kingdom succumbed to decadence, and it just meant they're weak, they're drunk, they're high, they're fornicating. They're obsessed with nice finery. And if you went in there with a couple of the 1,000 of the meanest dudes, you could probably slit everyone's throat. And then guess what they did? That's what they did that for 30 straight years. Yeah. And I've been reading that, just the way they're so matter of fact. It's like, how many soldiers do they have? How many cattle do they have? Are they decadent? Yes, no. This is strategic matters. And I think the rest of the world is looking at us. And I think that the left's looking at this. And we're sitting there like, we are decadent. We're weak internally. We're weak externally. we're so decadent that our president right now is claiming, like trying to tell our Pentagon and getting in fights with them, that global warming is the number one threat to our security.
Is it capitalist decadence? Is this late stage capitalist decadence? That's a question for an entire podcast, but you have an interesting, I think, perspective on this.
I think we're moving past capitalism into this oligarchy, and then maybe that's a bigger podcast too. But it makes me start to wonder. I mean, if you look at the constancy of humanity, is oligarchy the natural state?
Yeah.
Oh, it's starting to get a pretty good record for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
that'll uplift you. Go to church on Sunday.
For a while, we defeated that. It felt like it, at least. Well, this has been a very heavy and loaded episode of Federalist Radio Hour. I'm here with my colleagues, Christopher Bedford, senior editor at the Federalist, and Kylie Zempel, assistant editor at the Federalist, who, by the way, if you're watching this, her glass is literally half full.
Yeah.
But Chris and mine are empty, so I don't know what the metaphor is.
And if you want to be uplifted, definitely go back and watch Saturday Night Live, Ben Affleck, Dunkin' Donuts.
Oh, it is great.
I can talk to you about race in the morning at Starbucks.
if you want to be uplifted, Google these words: Ben Affleck back tattoo. No, yes, Christopher, yes. All right. Well, you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist.
You already said that.
We'll be back soon with more. Shut up. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.